I received an inquiry on my YouTube channel yesterday from Soul of the Bang, who often asks very pertinent, important, sometimes challenging questions about issues that are popular in the news at the moment. And yesterday what he asked was if I could share my perspectives and thoughts on the incident that occurred last weekend where 50-year-old Walter Scott, a black man in South Carolina, was gunned down from behind as he ran away from a police officer named Slagger. And this was all caught on videotape and was very, clear misuse of deadly force. And so Soul of the Bang wanted to know, first in general, what I thought about the incident, what I thought about the use of force by police, the influence of the media on that use, whether I thought there were race issues or important racial tensions that might erupt even into a race war between white people and people of color, especially black people, or also between white police and people of color. All of these kind of things that this incident brings to the forefront. And this is not the first case. I mean, over the last couple of years, we've seen, because of the availability of video recorded media. All you need is a cell phone to start recording a video now and upload it for everybody to see online. I think we're going to see more and more cases where incidents that might have been explained away otherwise won't be, because we have a clear video record of it by bystanders. And this is what happened in this incident. What appears to have occurred is that Slagger pulled over Walter Scott because he had a broken taillight. And this is usually pulling somebody over for a broken taillight. Right away there, it's almost like a profiling kind of a thing, because with the police, my understanding is they pull somebody over for a broken taillight. It usually just means they get an opportunity to run that person's data through their system and find out if there's anything that they need to pay attention to. In this case, Walter Scott did have some warrants. They were mainly warrants for contempt of court for failing to pay child make payments for child support and alimony, these kind of things. And so this must have been what Scott was afraid of. I'm speculating a little bit here, but one way or another, a scuffle broke out between Scott and Slagger. Scott was trying to get away from the scene. The scuffle broke out. There was a taser gun involved in the scuffle. It could have been that Scott was tasered, but it didn't stop him. Something happened, and it looks like the taser gun was dropped on the ground at some point back where the scuffle occurred. And then this is where the video kind of starts, is at the end of the scuffle. And Santana, the bystander who was filming the video, was very shy at first and had the camera kind of sideways, and he was trying to conceal it. And then he turned upright, and we see Walter Scott running away from Slagger, and Slagger draws down on him and fires 8 times at his back. I don't know how many bullets actually penetrated Scott, but he died on the scene. And it wasn't just that he was shot down and killed, but also when he went down, Then Slager walks up to him and has him put his hand on his back and appears to like cuff him there with his hands on his back. Doesn't administer any first aid. In fact, what appears to happen is he goes back to the scene of the scuffle, picks up what might have been a taser, brings it back and drops it next to Scott to put together a kind of a narrative where Scott had his taser gun. But that doesn't appear to be the actual case. Maybe at some point in the scuffle, Scott grabbed the gun, but when he was running away, from what we can see from the video, he's running away empty-handed, and he's just trying to get away. And this Slager draws down and fires and kills him. And the video is so clear that there was no question in the minds, it seems, of the attorneys in South Carolina. Slager was arrested for murder and is being held without bail, which is how it should be. So, given that incident and the plethora of related incidents that have occurred over the last couple of years, where it seems that white law enforcement officers are misusing force against black men, what are my thoughts? Well, first of all, my opinions concerning the police is that there's serious issues within the recruiting of police officers in general, and within the tolerance of racism amongst some police departments. You can't really generalize and say it's like this across the board, because it isn't. But in my experience, the racism does occur in some places. And when I say in my experience, I mean actually in my experience. There was a time growing up when, probably like many young men, I considered being a police officer, going into law enforcement. I considered either doing that or in some way becoming like maybe a private detective, something that was still kind of aligned with policing. I've always had a sense of wanting to serve a duty to my community or to people in general, and this is what brought me into going into military service, and what's guided most of my life's works or interests in being of service to the betterment of my community and mankind. Although oftentimes the media has put me into situations where I thought I would be of service where I was not, and the military is a good example. But in any case, when I was growing up, there was a time when I considered, in fact there was probably multiple times when I considered going into law enforcement. But when I was around 17, I was able to get a little bit of a taste for it by going on a ride-along overnight with our local police force in Kaiser, Oregon, where I was growing up. And that evening totally turned me off of law enforcement, and it was because of the way that racism was naturalized among the police. The incident that I remember most strongly, although there were several incidents in that night where I observed racism, but the one that held most strong in my memory was that we had arrested this man for public drunkenness, and he was from the South. He was either from Mexico or Guatemala or somewhere from the South. A lot of times in Oregon, well, almost all white people just generalize and call everybody that's up there from down south just Mexican, but they don't know. Some people speak Spanish, some people speak Nahuatl, some people speak Mayan, It's not all just one people that come up, and mostly for labor jobs, working in the farms and such. But this man who we picked up was middle-aged, and he was really drunk. They brought him to the police station and were trying to administer a breathalyzer exam on him. And he didn't want to blow into the tube, and he seemed to not understand what was being asked of him, though the police felt that he was just using the fact that he is not from there and speaks a different language to avoid the test by acting like he didn't know what was being asked of him. They thought he did know. And so after several attempts to get him to blow into the breathalyzer machine, one of the police officers said, "We want you to blow into the tube, you fucking spick." And at that point, the man looked up and scowled at him. And the police officer says, "Oh, you understood that, didn't you?" So it was such a clear and ugly racist scene that that turned me off from being a cop. And it told me that cops have race issues, and not only just that one incident, but during that night, they had profiled several people who were from down south for things like having broken taillights and such. And this is why I understand what they do when they pull over somebody with a broken taillight, is just use an opportunity to run their information to find out if there's any warrants or anything wrong with them. But otherwise, if they thought it was a rich white person driving around in a Cadillac and their tail light's not working, they're not going to pull them over. But when they see a shitty car, a junker, and there's something wrong with it, then they do. They profile, and most of the time those are people in Oregon. Those are people from down south who are up doing labor work in the farms. So I didn't like it, and so I didn't pursue that interest any further. My friend, however, who was with me for the ride-along, did continue. He went to college for, what do they call it? It's not law enforcement, but in any case, he lined himself up on the right path in college and became a police officer, worked for a sheriff's department. And as he was going through his training, it was criminal justice, that's what it is. As he's going through his training, at one point I was talking to him, and he said, "Ryan, I just want to tell you up front, I've learned to use my command voice. And, sometimes I don't realize that I'm using it because it's become second nature to me. So if I ever go off on you and I'm using my command voice, just know that it's not something that I'm purposely doing. It's just a part of me, and don't take offense to it." And I told him, "Brother, if you use any command voice on me, our friendship is done, right? I'm not playing that game. If you don't have control of just your voice," I mean, you think about that. If a guy can't even control how he uses his voice, how is he going to control his weapons, his actual weapons? All right, so let's consider for a minute the training that the police receive. From what I know with my friend, his training focused primarily on, his training for violent situations, I should say, or kind of encounters in general, because the command voice is used in all kinds of scenarios, not just in violent situations, but situations that have potentially dangerous elements to them. A police officer has many weapons at his disposal. Of course, he gets some training in what do you call it? controlling a suspect, and you'll have some training in using the command voice, and you'll have some training in using mace, and you'll have some training in using a stick. He'll have some training in using the stun guns, have some training in using firearms. And from my friend's experience and what he shared with me, there was a heavy emphasis on the sidearm, the actual gun, the firearm. And I remember when my friend was going through the training, I remember him telling me that every day he would practice drawing down in the mirror, trying to get it quick, his drawdown, so that he could make it happen at a moment's notice without hesitation. Going to the firing range all the time. My friend was kind of obsessed with firearms, as I think a lot of Americans are, but especially perhaps if you're a police officer. In terms of their training, I think it is important to have a lot of work with the firearm, to be able to use it instantaneously, and to be able to use it at appropriate moments. And I suspect that in South Carolina they receive all of that training. I suspect that this Officer Slager received a lot of firearms training, both in how to use his weapon and in when. And he misused it, that's what I'm saying. But where I think the training was probably deficient for Slager, and where I think it's probably deficient in a lot of police departments and sheriff's offices and such, is in the regular hand-to-hand combat. There was a scuffle between Walter Scott and Slager, a scuffle that ended up with Scott being on the run, perhaps with Scott having taken control, for a moment at least, of Slager's stun gun, and I think it probably left Slager scared, in a heightened state of fear, that he was not able to handle himself in a scuffle and have control of the situation. And I suspect that fear is what compelled him to draw down, even though the man was fleeing and shooting. And I'm not trying to justify what he did. I think Slager should be charged. Not only charged, but I think the charges should stick with murder, because that's what he did. Do I think it's his fault that he murdered Walter Scott? Yes, I do. But I also think that part of the blame resides in a lack of hand-to-hand combat training. I think people that are in the police should receive very realistic combat training for a number of years. I think, for the whole time that you're a police officer, you should be training martial arts, realistic street fighting, and simulating scenarios of the type that Slager encountered here. And I think that training should be every week, and it should be the duration. It should be a couple of years at least before even going on the street as a police officer, and then forever thereafter, as long as you're on the job, you should be training that, because you can never train enough martial arts. And the sad fact is, I think most of these guys might receive a couple of weeks of training, with the hand-to-hand, with the controls and all of that, and then they might get a brush up now and then, but it's not nearly enough. they don't spend as much time with the hand-to-hand for sure as they spend with their firearms. And the firearm is the piece you're going to use less often. I think it should be weighted. You know, how often are you going to have to use this skill? Well, that's how much extra training you need to be putting into it. So if you're going to train with the firearms all the time, have to qualify once a year and all of this, you should be training with the hand-to-hand much more, and have to qualify, you know, at least equally with the firearms. So I guess what I'm saying in short is that I don't think the police get enough martial arts training away from their weapons, just the use of their body. I don't think they learn how to use it very well. And I've seen so many cops that are not in good shape. And I think there should be fitness standards for police, and I think there should be, you know, martial arts tactical standards for police that, you know, they have to pass those standards if they're going to be on the force. Because otherwise they are a danger. They're very serious danger, just out of the human nature in a sense, to be out there, because if they get in a scuffle and they can't control the situation because they don't know what they're doing, that's going to put a whole nother dimension of fear into them. I mean, it's already scary enough to get in a fight, but to get in a fight and be ill-equipped for that is not a good thing. If you're in the profession of encountering potentially dangerous situations like that and being asked to protect others in those scenarios, how are you going to do that if you don't have the training? What ends up happening is you get people that have a heightened sense of fear and are more apt to use excessive force. Doesn't always have to be the gun, but you know, we saw, and it doesn't always have to be race related either. Like we saw in recent protests throughout the US, we saw police forces using excessive force on white college students, university students. You know, when you see cops out there using mace and tear gas on people that are absolutely not threatening physically, that's bad, you know? But that's not to say that the race issue didn't play into the fear as well, because I think it did. I think there's two things that happened to Slager. One is he wasn't able to control the scuffle, and so that heightened his fear. Two, I suspect he was probably racist. That's big conjecture, but you know, to shoot a man running away in the back, and this happens again and again, right? And it keeps happening with white cops and black men. The excessive force, and it's different than, you know, white college students having excessive force used on them by the police in these protest situations, because in these other situations, I mean, they're just individual encounters, and often they seem to involve the police officer not knowing how to handle himself in a fist fight, and it turns into him gunning down a suspect that should not be gunned down. I mean, that's escalating to the highest level, the act of violence that is occurring. I think, you know, I know there's racism involved, and I am saying that you can't project that racism across all white police officers, but in general, you know, I'd say there is a general fear in white people of people of color. It's not always black people, that's why I said people of color. It all depends on the dynamics of the place. So like in South Carolina, for instance, is probably the highest racial tension is between black and white. Here where I live, the highest racial tension is between Indian and white. In Oregon, where I grew up, the highest racial tension was between, you know, people from the South, Mexican, Guatemalan, Navajo people. It was between, you know, them and the white. It's always, the white's always the other side of the polemic. And the white people have that fear. And I'm not saying that people of color don't fear. They're now definitely fearing the police, because the police continue to, you know, time and again use excessive force on them. I fear the police, and I'm a white guy. So if I fear, I know some comedian said that at some time, and I don't even remember who it was, or I give him credit. But if I'm a white guy and I fear police, imagine, you know, what a person of color must feel when confronted with the white police. So I think there is a racism involved, and I think that's what, you know, the other element that pushes it over the edge. So I think it's lack of training and racism. And I think people with race issues could be screened out. They could be screened out. It might be really difficult to screen them out, you know, because some people hide their racism really well. And, you know, to some extent, probably the majority of people out there have some racist issues. But at least in my encounters with police, like, if a police officer would ever say something like, you know, we want you to breathe into this tube, you fucking spick, and think that that's okay, wow. I mean, that's just mind-reeling. So even if a guy doesn't seem to harbor racism, on the job, you should identify it very, very readily. The racial profiling stuff has to stop completely. The heightened surveillance of people of color that seems to be regular protocol for the police now, and it has been for a long time. That has to stop. Somehow that has to stop. You know, because of my situation, where I live, and the fact that I'm kind of between cultures and such, you know, because I do follow like Blackfoot ways of living and knowing and believing, and yet I'm also very familiar with the white mainstream, because that's what I grew up with. I'm in between, and I get to see it play out a lot, and I'm also, you know, a victim of racism, even though people say that, you know, white people can't experience racism. I recently lost my job, and I think it's largely because of racism that I lost my job. You know, somehow we have to stop the racism, and I've put a lot of thought to it. And you know, a lot of times when I'm thinking about issues with humans, I bounce it off of nature, and I look at what nature has to say, and how other species operate, and this kind of thing. And one of the things that I was observing just the other day, I had a student. We were out in the field. I was telling him about the life of mallard ducks, and how mallards, in a way, defy mainstream science's strict definition of the species, because mallard drakes will mate with ducks of other supposed species, and they would have viable offspring. And that's not supposed to be able to happen between species, between different species. And but it does with the mallards. And I also noted that the trees that we have down in the coulees, trees that we have down in the coulees, we've got these 3 different kinds of poplar trees. We got balsam poplar, we got western cottonwood, or plains cottonwood, and we got narrowleaf cottonwood. And in the mainstream, they're considered to be 3 different species. And yet, these 3 trees hybridize among each other. And it seems to me that in some way, some of the knowledge of the mainstream culture, and probably a lot of different cultures too, but they look at the appearance of things and they see people or things as different from each other based on those appearances, when in fact they may very well be the same. This is what happens with mallards and some of the other species of ducks. Probably some of the species of teals and stuff should just be categorized with mallards, because they're breeding species altogether. Same with those poplar trees. In Blackfoot, all those poplar trees are called seats, and they all have the same name, even though there's 3 different species recognized by the mainstream. In Blackfoot, it's just recognized as 1 species. And this is the problem among humans and the whole racism thing. From my perspective, we're all just human beings. But our culture teaches us to adopt these other categories, to adopt class, to adopt race, even to some extent gender, although you can't argue there's male and female genders. But there's those people that are in between, right? So, but we take on these labels, we take on these other identities, we take on political identities that our culture has given us to take, and we forget that we're all just human beings, and that there's really not such a difference between us. And so somehow, when I think of the police who are tasked with protecting the public, and the public consists of people of different ethnicities, different races, different languages, different socioeconomic classes, all of these different categories are all contained within that bubble of the public. And the police need to look at the members of that public as human beings, and not as this or that. And it's, however deep it is embedded, this needs to be a central ethics that's trained with the police to perceive the people that they encounter as human beings, not as a black man or this and that. Right? Whenever you see police reports, it's always black or Mexican or what have you. They don't just say man. They always got to attach those categories. So there's a reinforcement going on constantly that there are these different categories, and just growing up in different areas of the Americas, you grow up in a culture of racism. And in some places that racism is very strong. And in a place like South Carolina, which is basically the South, you have a very strong black and white racism. And there's fear always involved in that racism. And so my opinion is that it was the fear plus the lack of proper training that brought this incident about, and that if we don't want to see further incidences like this, we need to somehow either select people that don't have that racist fear, or who it's minimal in, at the very least, and we need to train them very well. Otherwise, I think we're going to continue to see this again and again and again, because the selection process is not being careful enough. Whatever the standards are, they're not the standards that are needed with the police. And I think it's hard to find somebody really out there who meets the highest standards. But those are the people that need to be searched for. And if there's not enough of them, then we need to somehow make those people. And we need to do this same work within ourselves generally, in the cultures of the Americas, both on the United States and Canada side and the whole way around. We all need to do some of this work, together to get rid of these kind of categories and start thinking of ourselves as collectively, as human beings again. It's going to be tough work because the culture is arranged so that those social categories and that structure is embedded in just about everything we do. But yeah, I don't think a race war is going to help anything, if there was to be such a thing. I think that would just further embed the fear. I think we need to do something else, to get rid of it. But it has to get gotten rid of. And I really question whether the police need to carry all the kind of weapons that they do. I'm not suggesting that we should put police into a situation where their life is being threatened because they don't have the right weapon on hand. But there sure is a lot of misuse of those weapons. And there sure is a lot of abuse where the police are used for political purposes rather than serving the public. As when they break up peaceful protests with violence. So I don't know. I don't have all the answers, obviously, but my thoughts are they need a lot more hand-to-hand training, and we need to have less racism, certainly among police, at the very least among police.